Welcome to another episode of the discussion series organized by Law and Society Trust on the Sri Lanka's present economic crisis. Today we have with us Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, Senior Lecturer, University of Jaffna. First, I would like to ask you about how you see the present economic crisis and how it has evolved to the present situation.
Sri Lanka is probably in the worst economic crisis since the 1930s. People have different explanations of how we got here. Most recently, the war in Ukraine has increased global oil prices, global commodity prices, and the price hikes we are seeing in Sri Lanka today is also affected by that. The government claims that this crisis is because of the pandemic and the lockdowns, which completely shut down our tourism sector. And with the fall of foreign earnings from tourism, that has also contributed to the dollar crisis. The opposition, a number of our think tanks claim this crisis is caused by the tax cuts that were brought about by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa soon after the election in November 2019. But I see this as a much longer crisis that has emerged with the open economy policies, or what internationally is known as neoliberal policies, from the late 1970s. That's when we opened up our economy to market forces, trade liberalization, liberalization of finance, increased privatization, cuts to social welfare. It was a policy package that put Sri Lanka on a different direction. Even though there was initially high growth from 1978 to 1981, that bubble started to burst, and as growth declined, the government became more and more repressive. We all know how the government crushed the trade unions in July 1980, from which to this day they have not recovered. And then they became also repressive to the minorities, particularly the Tamil minority. The Jaffna Public Library was burnt in 1981, and then the July 1983 pogrom, where 2,000 to 3,000 Tamil people were killed. And that led to the civil war. And during this long civil war of 26 years, successive governments, while they were on the same economic trajectory, they could not accelerate reforms because they had to fight the war. Their urgency was to address the war with increasing military spending, to figure out how to fight the war. After 2009, the Rajapaksa regime at that time put forward Sri Lanka as a very stable country ready for development. And they accelerated neoliberal reforms. In July 2009, we went for an IMF agreement. And following that, there was a lot of capital that came into Sri Lanka. In about 18 months after the war, even as capital was flowing into all the emerging markets because of the global financial crisis of 2008, Sri Lanka was not only seen as an emerging market, it was also seen as a post-conflict economy. Our stock market quadrupled, became 4 times in value. It was that kind of a bubble. We invested in beautifying Colombo, large infrastructure was built. Sri Lanka showed very high rates of GDP growth, almost 8% per year for 3 years. But again, that bubble burst. And this time, the Rajapaksa regime decided to show the Muslim community as the enemy. And they started attacking the Muslim community. Trade union struggles started to mount. The Rajapaksas were thrown out of power in 2015. The new government that came to power, they continued in the same direction. In June 2016, we went into another IMF agreement. In July 2016, a month later, we floated $1.5 billion US in sovereign bonds. So throughout our post-war decade, we have been borrowing, particularly in the international capital markets, what are called sovereign bonds, basically loans that we take from big banks, mutual funds, investors in the West at very high interest rates. Right now, 40% of our external debt is owed as sovereign bonds. Those bonds are on the order of average about 7.5% interest rate annual, and keep in mind these are dollar denominated bonds. So in other words, if you take a loan 10 years ago, you normally pay these sovereign bonds in 5 or 10 years. 10 years later, the interest itself is equivalent to the principal. If you took 500 million US dollars, we're going to be paying 500 million US dollars more in interest costs. That is how we got into this debt trap. We were already headed into a crisis, I would argue, from the 1970s and certainly over the last decade. The pandemic, the mismanagement by this current Rajapaksa regime pushed us over the cliff into this economic crisis. We have to understand this long-term view, the policy trajectory we are on, if we are going to solve this crisis. We're going to have to change that whole trajectory. And given how long it took to make this crisis, it is going to be a long battle to come out of this.
So this is a crisis evolved through 4 decades. So we have followed the new neoliberal economic policies since 1977. So is it the neoliberal policies or the way we have implemented them created this crisis?
In a sense, the crisis in Sri Lanka is a neoliberal crisis, a crisis that neoliberal policies, or what we call open economy policies in Sri Lanka, has created. Back in 1977-78, we started liberalizing trade, including in agriculture. Today, we are going through a food crisis. I would trace that to 4 decades back when we created those flawed policies. In the 1970s, we had a vision of trying to become self-sufficient, at least in food. But once you liberalize trade, we are unable to compete with larger countries like India and Pakistan, who have much lower cost of production of vegetables, for example. We are unable to compete, and we become increasingly dependent on imports. We'll take something like seafood, fisheries. Over the last 4 decades, we continue to focus on high-value seafood for exports. Blue swimming crab, big prawns, sea cucumber. But our people, 70% of their animal protein is dependent on seafood, and they eat much lower value seafood, such as dry fish, sprats, moldy fish. But we neglected production of what our people eat. We are an island nation. We export maybe 250 million US dollars worth of seafood. We also import 200 million US dollars worth of seafood. And in a crisis like we are in now, we don't have milk powder, we don't have seafood. Our next generation's nutrition is at stake. That is one example of how these neoliberal policies have affected us. We are now talking about rolling over our debt, about going to the IMF to try to move forward. But what is the solution there? Is to only get more debt. Already our government's debt is over 100% of GDP. That is both domestic and external debt. And what are we going to do? We are going to continue to increase our external debt without prioritizing our imports, because if you're committed to a free trade regime, you can't prioritize, you can't restrict imports. Over the last 10 years, we were importing luxury cars, luxury fittings for our hotels. What has been the return on this? So those are all consequences of neoliberal policies. Our people are in a major way affected by the corona crisis, but we are not giving them relief. because we cut the food subsidy back in the late 1970s. So these neoliberal policies have been very anti-people, and we need to shift the direction of these policies, where society again becomes responsible for our people, as opposed to asking every individual to take over the burden of their economic life.
If going to IMF is not a solution to this crisis, then what are the possible options we have ahead of us?
2 years ago, it was clear to many of us, and I myself in many articles mentioned that this crisis is going to deepen, that we have to prepare, that we have to take certain steps to avoid this scale of crisis. But the government did not take any steps. Our opposition in parliament was very silent, and our think tanks, all they said was, let's go to the IMF. We could have prioritized our imports so that we kept our foreign exchange to ensure that we import the essentials like food, medicines, oil, and any intermediate goods necessary for production and exports. That kind of policies were not taken forward. We let the crisis drag on to a point where now all the actors are saying the only option is to go and fall at other actors, whether it's India, China, or the IMF. The situation is such that already our government is implementing the policies that are recommended by the IMF. We have floated our exchange rate. Today or yesterday, we have doubled our interest rates so that we can control inflation. And this question of inflation has to be debated. Is this inflation, or is this caused by floating the rupee and the much higher cost we have to pay for imported goods when the government is not controlling prices? It's very likely in the weeks and months ahead we are going to increase our value-added tax again. That is again a recommendation of the IMF. So whether we are going to the IMF or not, we are already on the IMF path, and the people are having to face the pain of these kinds of policies. We do not have to go in this path. We did not have to go in this path. We have to continue to place people's concerns foremost. What could we have done, and what should we be doing going forward? We should have prioritized imports. It's a major food crisis. We should have given importance to food and to keep our economy running. But to do that, you need a public distribution system as well. If you allow traders to decide what is going to be imported, how they are going to distribute it, they are going to hoard if they think prices are going to go up. That's what we are seeing in Sri Lanka. Even when there are supplies, it's not reaching the people because they're going to wait till the price goes up. So we need a public distribution system. We had a public distribution system in the 1970s. Our neighboring countries like India, even today, have a public distribution system. But we dismantled that. We need to revive that public distribution system. We have to strengthen the cooperative wholesale establishment, the food commissioners department, the paddy marketing board. These are part of that public distribution system. We also have to figure out, if prices are going up, how can the government provide relief to the people by reducing the prices even as they are distributing the goods? There needs to be redistribution. That would require, of course, government income or government revenues, which are abysmally low. Sri Lanka's government revenues now are on the order of 8 to 9% of GDP, one of the lowest in the world. We should be aiming at something like 25% of GDP. Because with neoliberal policies, we gave tax cuts to the rich over the decades, and we even this 8-9% mainly comes from regressive tax policies such as indirect taxes like the VAT. As the economy is shrinking, it's also very hard to increase taxes. but it looks like the government is going to increase the burden on the people. So what can we do? We can have a wealth tax, for example. Incomes are a flow that come every year. Wealth is accumulated over years. So property, vehicles. If somebody has 3 houses, maybe they should be paying a very high tax on their second and third house. These are policies that we see around the world, but in Sri Lanka we don't have policies like that. And if they can't pay the property tax, maybe then they should sell their third house and pay that. We're going to have to make such hard decisions amidst this crisis because our people are on the verge of starvation. So we are going to have to look at a very different trajectory of the economy with redistribution. And going to the IMF or going with the policies that the IMF has recommended, which we are already moving, is only going to increase the hardships of the people, increase the debt that Sri Lanka has, and prolong the crisis. So we need a new vision, a new direction for the economy.
You said that we need to prioritize imports and we need to establish strong public distribution systems. Some fear that this type of economic reforms will lead to a situation where we suffered in the 1970s. And this is a context where we have connected to a global capitalist system. So is it possible to implement these type of reforms in the present situation?
The global economy is also going through great changes. After the global economic downturn of the 1970s, when Sri Lanka was affected, like many other countries, in a very similar moment to what we are in now. Due to the OPEC oil shock, the price of oil in global markets went up 4-fold in the 1970s. Economic growth was down, and it was that situation that was used as an opportunity by finance capital to shove down neoliberal globalization. The peak of such neoliberal globalization was in the 1990s, when global trade growth was almost 3 times global GDP growth. So they opened up markets so that everybody started to trade much more. That started creating many crises. There was financial and economic crisis in Latin America, in East Asia, and then even in the Western countries in the late 2000s, where over the last decade there's been a complete change. Now, global trade growth is much slower than global GDP growth. So globalization has ended. We are going into a new era. The same price hikes are being seen in many other parts of the world as well. Sri Lanka is in a much more severe crisis, but the entire world is also shifting direction. And we might be the first to start going in that other direction where other countries are also going to change. In 1978, when Sri Lanka shifted to neoliberal policies, much of South Asia wasn't. We were one of the first. And then other countries followed. India only fully liberalized its country economy in 1991. So again, with this crisis, we might be the first to shift direction. It's very likely that other countries are also going to change. Capitalism and the global economy changes with times, and these crises are the times of great change. Unfortunately, our mainstream economists, our policymakers, in my view, they are stuck in the 1990s. They are not looking at the great changes going on around the world. And I think it's important to make our people aware, to prepare them for this great change. During times of great crises, great changes come about. In the 1930s, the Great Depression, we almost had famine type of conditions, very similar to the moment now. There was the malaria crisis, where 2% of our population died. And people die from malaria even more when nutrition falls, because they're less healthy, they can't face the malaria disease. Out of all that, Our leaders had the vision to put in place policies like free healthcare, free education, the food subsidy. So that crisis led to many progressive changes. The crisis in the 70s pushed us in the direction of neoliberalism. The crisis that we are now going through could possibly go in either direction. It's our people. We are the ones who are going to decide, do we want to go in a progressive direction, or do we want to go towards the hell of more accelerated neoliberal reforms?
Economic crisis has become a political crisis now. People are on the streets. So, in this type of a context, is it possible to implement radical economic changes that you are suggesting?
Great economic crises also lead to major political changes. The crisis of the 1970s not only set us on the path of the open economy, we saw the rise of the Jayawardena regime. He created the executive presidency, created a state of emergency, brought about the Prevention of Terrorism Act, crushed the trade unions, had a referendum and undermined democracy. Those were related to the political economy of our country. We are in a similar moment. This economic crisis has brought out people out on the streets like the way perhaps only in 1953 with the Great Hartal when people came out on the streets. It's going to lead to major changes. What changes are a priority? I would say the executive presidency, where so much power is in one individual, that centralized state, that centralized neoliberal state with power concentrated is critical for taking forward neoliberal reforms. I think now the people are telling President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to go home, but they should also make sure this is an end to any future president of that sort. So ultimately here is a question about democratization. Do we want to continue to have the Prevention of Terrorism Act? Do we want to allow the government to call states of emergency when people are rising up and putting forward genuine demands? I think the people have spoken well before political analysts. They are setting the direction, but everyone should be supporting those protests towards bringing about the kind of political changes that will ensure there is democracy. Because if we are to have an equal economy, an economy grounded on equality and freedom and welfare that supports our people, it has to be on the basis of democracy. And that kind of a radical democracy is the need of the hour.
Within global politics, we are a vulnerable country. All the superpowers, China, India, USA, they are making a lot of influence on us. If we try to transform our economic and political system, how will these countries react?
Sri Lanka has been a dependent economy. That history goes back to almost 5 centuries of colonialism. And even after we gained independence, we've been a dependent economy. Our policies are not based on where we want our economy to go. And particularly over the last 4 decades with neoliberalism, we have become even more dependent on the international financial markets, for example. And it is in this context that Sri Lanka has also become a pawn in a geopolitical game between India, China, the United States. We went through a civil war also partly because of these kinds of geopolitical problems. But we always run into problem because we are not able to set our direction. If we are going to be a divided people, if we are going to think as majority and minority and not address the concerns of all the people in this country, we will be divided and used by other actors. That's what the colonial powers did, and that is what is happening now, and that will continue to happen. So we have to be very clear on the economic direction we want to go. We have to be very clear about building a plural country where all people believe they can live with dignity, where the rights of minorities are recognized. If we can set a very clear direction that is democratic and the direction that we want to go in a self-sufficient economy, where we are not dependent as much on the external sector, that is our safest bet to stay clear of these geopolitical games which will only weaken us, which will only destroy us. We have nothing to gain when large powers are using us as a pawn. So we need to first get our direction clear. In the 1960s and 70s, we had a non-aligned foreign policy. We have to continue to think in those terms. In a crisis like this, where we are short of food, on a humanitarian basis, we should appeal to all actors. But we should also be clear it is on a humanitarian basis, that we don't want to get into their political conflicts. It is on that basis that we have to chart both our foreign policy and our economic policy. The more dependent we become on other actors, the more difficult our social, economic and political situation is going to be. That's why I'm even critical of the tourism sector. If we think tourism is our future, we are dependent on whether it's Chinese tourists, Indian tourists or Western tourists for our own economic life. If there's a crisis elsewhere, suddenly we go into an even deeper crisis. So we have to first begin with our priorities when it comes to the economy. Food, self-sufficiency in food, trying to provide enough employment to our people, and then think about the export sector so that if we want to get luxuries and import luxuries. So we have to have a very clear vision if we are to address these difficult times, because the decade ahead, the 2 decades ahead, the global order is also unraveling. We are likely to see much more tensions and conflicts by these big powers, and we don't want to be caught in that. We want to remain self-sufficient and we want to remain non-aligned.
Thank you, Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, for being with us and sharing your views today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.